welcome to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Ladi Akiri Doluale. The headlines. At least 26 people, including 3 children, are injured in a Russian missile attack on Dnipropetrovsk. Four civilians are killed by Ukrainian shelling in the Russian border region of Bryansk. Plus, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Kiev will launch its counteroffensive against Russia despite not having received Western fighter aircraft. We begin news this morning with breaking stuff out of Ukraine, which says that Russia has launched a fresh round of deadly missile attacks on that country. The Ukrainian military says the eastern cities of Kramatorsk, Kostyanivka, and Pavlovrad were targeted in the attacks. The Russians are also said to have carried out 27 airstrikes and fired 45 MLRS, that is, multiple rocket systems shells at Ukrainian positions and inhabited areas, resulting in deaths and injuries amongst the civilian population. However, the statement did not specify the number of civilians that were said to have been killed or injured, or indeed where. And Russia's Ministry of Defense has replaced its deputy defense minister in charge of logistics, making a change in military leadership just as Russian forces gear up for a Ukrainian counteroffensive. The ministry announced the move in a Telegram post, saying Alexei Kuzmenkov, a colonel general who has held a variety of leadership roles in Russia's military, has now been appointed to the position, which was previously held by Colonel General Mikhail Mintsev. However, Moscow did not immediately provide a reason for General Mintsev's being replaced. And a streak of tracer fire lit up the sky over Kiev in the early hours of today as Ukrainian air defense systems tried to repel Russian missile attacks, and air raid sirens blared across the country for more than 3 hours. According to preliminary information, the city administration said there were no casualties among the civilian population and no destruction of residential facilities or infrastructure have so far been recorded. Ukrainian media also reported blasts in the Dnipro and Sumy regions. Russia has intensified its missile attacks on Ukraine in the past few days. And at least 25 people, including 3 children, have been injured in a Russian missile attack on Protafrovsk overnight, and that's according to the Ukrainian region's governor. In a statement, Governor Serhiy Lysak said the missiles hit a residential area in the city of Pavlovrad, damaging homes, schools, and stores. He adds that rescue operations are now underway in the areas of the attack. Meanwhile, 4 civilians have been killed by Ukrainian shelling in the Russian border region of Bryansk. According to the local governor, Alexander Bogomaz, the strikes hit residential buildings in the village of Suzemka in Sezemsky region. The Bryansk region shares a border to its south with Ukraine and to its west with Belarus. Russian officials have blamed Ukraine for a spate of attacks this weekend. Authorities in Russian-occupied Donetsk said 2 people died and 12 were injured in shelling over the weekend. In the meantime, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces said in a statement that Ukraine's air defense forces intercepted 15 of 18 Russian cruise missiles fired from the northwestern Russian Arctic and Caspian Sea regions. Valery Zaluzhny said, quote, at about 2:30 a.m., Russian occupiers attacked Ukraine using strategic aircraft. There were 9 Tu-95s from the area of Olenogovsk, which is in the Murmansk region, and 2 Tu-160s from the Caspian Sea. It comes after the Ukrainian military said Russia launched a fresh round of deadly missile attacks on the country, resulting in an unspecified number of casualties. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Kiev will launch its counteroffensive against Russian forces despite not having received Western fighter aircraft. Mr. Zelensky has on multiple occasions appealed to the West to widen the scope of its military aid for Ukraine. Speaking to Scandinavian journalists in Kiev, Mr. Zelensky added that there were countries that have F-16 and other Western-kind aircraft that were ready to help Ukraine. The Ukrainian Air Force only has Soviet-era fighter aircraft.
We need to understand that we can't drag the counteroffensive out, which is why we'll start before we receive F-16s or other models. But to calm Russia down, with the fact that we still need a couple of months to train on the aircraft, and only then we'll start a counteroffensive.
Ми почнемо і будемо йти вперед паралельно. Я вважаю, що це дуже потрібно.
And some 400 Russian convicts have arrived in Ukraine to reinforce Wagner mercenaries fighting for Moscow in the country. And that's according to a statement from the Ukrainian military. The statement says the recruits were brought to a field camp in the Berdyansk district of Zaporizhia on Ukraine's southern coast, adding that as many as 200 more Wagner recruits are expected to arrive soon for training at a camp in the eastern Luhansk region. And the head of Wagner has threatened to withdraw his troops from the embattled eastern city of Bakhmut if they don't receive more munitions to continue the fight. The pointed warnings for Russian defense officials, including Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, comes as Bakhmut remains heavily contested. Yevgeny Prigozhin said, quote, "I am appealing to Sergei Shoigu with a request to issue ammunition immediately. Now, if this is refused, I deem it necessary to inform the commander-in-chief about the existing problems and to make a decision regarding the feasibility of continuing to station units in the settlement of Bakhmut, given the current shortage of ammunition." The Wagner brass claimed in an interview that those responsible for weapons procurement in Russia have stopped giving Wagner ammunition. He notes that losses in Bakhmut are 5 times higher than necessary because of a lack of artillery ammunition. The withdrawal of some fighters from Bakhmut would be likely, but he warned that this would mean the Russian front there would collapse. Meanwhile, a Ukrainian military spokesperson says Kiev is in control of a key supply route into Bakhmut. Russian forces have been trying for 10 months to punch their way into the shattered remains of what was once a city of 70,000 people. Kiev has pledged to defend Bakhmut, which Russia sees as a stepping stone to attacking other countries, or rather other cities. Serhiy Sharivati, a spokesperson for the Ukrainian troops in the east, said, for several weeks, the Russians have been talking about seizing the road of life, as well as about constant fire control over it. Sharivati added that the road of life is a vital road between the ruined Bakhmut and the nearby town Chasiv Yar to the west, a distance of just over 17 kilometers. Joining us now from Cambridge in England is Associate Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the university there, Rory Finnin. Good morning to you, Rory. Thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Lottie. Nice to see you.
Indeed. Let's start with the information that came out of Volodymyr Zelensky in the past couple of hours, where he said, look, we're going to go ahead with the counteroffensive, even though we haven't quite received the Western fighter aircraft that we were promised or that we expected. But he also mentioned that, look, even when we receive these aircraft, it will take months to learn how to work with them, train them, maintain them, and so on. Is that deliberate on his part to give, two conflicting bits of information and thereby confuse Russia, or is that, in fact, the situation on the ground?
I think the counteroffensive is something we've been talking about for a very long time. There's been a lot of anticipation about this counteroffensive because of the success the Ukrainian military had in retaking their territory last year along a number of different vectors in the country. There's a lot of speculation, and journalists are asking President Zelensky 1,000 questions about when this is going to take place. And of course, I think he needs to be very canny and strategic about what he reveals and what he does not reveal. The issue of the supply of F-16s is extremely important. So you've just reported what really, I think, cuts to the core of this war, that the Russian state is killing innocent people in their sleep, gunning them down with cruise missiles in the middle of the night. The Ukrainian Air Force eliminated 15 of those 18 missiles. But they've been taking innocent lives across the country in these waves of attacks. So what we have in opposition then is Ukrainian military forces reclaiming territory. And to protect the Ukrainian state and these innocent people from these strikes, a better air command is needed for Ukraine. And the F-16s in particular are really key. And it's rather baffling why, in fact, they're being withheld, because they will do a lot to secure peace and stability in the region. So I can see why President Zelensky keeps calling for F-16s, and also explains that, yes, of course, Ukrainian military personnel and pilots will need to be trained up. But as we've seen numerous times, that when these missiles, weapon systems, pieces of technology are provided to the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian military, because of the threat to their own people and to their country, they're learning up, as it were, on these devices very, very quickly, much faster than I think Western analysts ever anticipated.
But you mentioned it there because you said it's baffling that, the reason or why these weapons are being withheld. And as President Zelensky also pointed out, several countries in Europe, which are in the EU, and some who are in NATO and who are quite friendly, are ready to help Ukraine with this F-16s in particular. Some of them have F-16s. But then under the procurement deals that give these countries these fighter jets, you can't transfer them to a third party without the approval of those who sold them to you in the first place. So which goes back to the United States. And President Joe Biden has been quite clear that he does not intend, at least not now anyway, to give such approvals or to provide such equipment to Ukraine, because he doesn't want the United States in direct conflict with Russia. Does that make sense?
Honestly, Ladi, it doesn't make sense to me. Now, I'm not a military analyst, but I watch Russia and I study Ukraine. If one turns on Russian state television today, there are calls for legalizing the assassination of ambassadors. There is discussions about nuking the coast of the British Isles to cause a massive tsunami that would claim the lives of millions here. The Russian state is going to say whatever it wants about whatever the United States, NATO, Nigeria, the rest of the world is doing. They're generating their own reality all the time with a lot of disinformation and lies. The fact of the matter is that F-16s would provide that air support so that the Ukrainian people can keep themselves safe. This is not about, of course, attacking the Russian state with F-16s. That's absurd. But mainly it's about keeping control of their airspace, which is seen, as we know, weekly, regularly now, strikes against innocent people in their sleep in residential areas. No military targets nearby. So I personally don't understand why the U.S. is slow walking F-16s. They did this repeatedly with a number of different weapon systems after the 24th of February 2022. We've seen repeatedly that those weapon systems help the Ukrainian military protect their land and protect their people. But this slow walking of provision of these weapons has led to thousands of civilians getting killed on a regular basis. The Russian side has made very clear what they're interested in here. They want to conquer Ukraine. This is a 19th century war of an empire, an expansionist land empire, seeking to claim back one of its colonies. They're not going to stop until they achieve that objective of conquest. I think the world order is threatened by such a brazen and very, very brutal, immoral attack on a sovereign country. So I think the allies of Ukraine need to understand that Ukrainian victory is needed here for stability and peace to return to Europe. And the way to do that is to provide weapons, ammunition, and financial support to Ukraine.
But if, as you say, what is needed is for Ukraine to emerge victorious, the Russians have made it clear that if it gets to a stage where it does appear as if the Ukrainians are going to be victorious, they're going to use nuclear weapons. They've said that repeatedly over and over again. President Putin has said it, former President Dmitry Medvedev has said it, and they've gone one step further. They've announced that they are putting strategic nuclear weapons in Belarus, which is just a stone throw from Ukraine. So they're not kidding about this. And it'll be like, I don't know what to call it now, an end game, if you like, when we get to that stage, isn't it?
It's a clear threat. I would never want to underestimate the threat of nuclear weapons being used by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. And that's the key point. This is not some sort of global grandstanding that doesn't have a target. The target is Ukraine, and Ukrainians are willing to fight back despite these threats, despite this saber rattling that has been going on from the Kremlin for a very long time and is hugely reckless because it seeks to make normal the notion that a nuclear state can do whatever it wants, wherever it wants. And that is only going to lead to a international order in which everyone seeks out nuclear weapons and then seeks to do what they want with neighbors, with trade, based on that use of or potential use and threat of nuclear weapons. Clearly, over the long term, for generations of our children, that is a very dangerous prospect that needs to be stood on its head. We need to clearly oppose it. And we can't let this saber rattling, this use of nuclear weapons and the thought of the use of nuclear weapons stop us from actually adhering to our principles and to the international order that many states, like the U.S., have failed numerous times. To be completely clear, I mean, there are no clean hands here when it comes to international law, but we do have these principles, and I think it's important we uphold them. So if Ukrainians are willing to fight for their land, fight for their people, and we've seen what happens, Ladi, when Russian troops take Ukrainian territory. They torture, they imprison, they execute civilians for simply having, let's say, Ukrainian books, a Ukrainian mark in their home somewhere. This is a very grave and brutal attempt at a genocide of a nation of 40 million people. And so they need to fight back. They have no other choice. So if they're willing to take that risk because they're the target of these nuclear threats, then I think we need to, for our own sake, for the sake of generations after us, to stand up for these principles of protecting a country's territorial integrity and not letting threats like this go past us as a normal course of a day.
I'm happy, though not for the fact that you mentioned that a nation of 40 million people, about a quarter or to a third of those people have since left Ukraine and dispersed to several countries. One of those countries is where you are, the United Kingdom, which has opened its doors for Ukrainians who are fleeing this war, this invasion. Now, after the United States, one could say that, Britain is probably the single biggest country who has provided support for Ukraine. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson went personally to Kiev 2 or 3 times while he was Prime Minister. I think he's been there once since he stopped being Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak has received Volodymyr Zelensky in London, and Britain has been among the countries that promised military hardware, Challenger tanks, and all of that. But Britain also has its own economic crisis, which the political leadership is dealing with at home. And the question, I guess, is, do you think this robust support that has been on since February of last year can continue, given the distraction that the political leadership is facing at home with the issues of economic challenges that have cropped up? How committed do you think Rishi Sunak and the British government can be, given the other challenges that they face?
It's always hard to know how committed any politician is, to be honest, if we're speaking plainly. I do think popular support for Ukraine here in Britain, and I would say across Europe and many places I've been to around the world, particularly those who are able to see how this is a neo-imperial war that threatens us all for generations to come. And we need to be clear and coherent in our response to it. I think the danger is always that politicians will become distracted, as you said, and I think it's a very good word, by their own domestic problems, or, as we've seen in the case of British and Ukrainian, American history in the past, they'll seek to distract their own public by supporting wars and promoting wars. I don't think this is the case here at all, but I think it's very important that we talk about the people who are calling their constituents, calling their MPs in parliament to voice their support for the Ukrainian people, even if goods are more expensive than they've been in the past, even if there's record inflation. I think people understand that we can't get back on better economic footing in a world in which might makes right, and those who execute, maim, and torture civilians openly, almost proudly, almost celebrated on their state television, as you said before, threaten the use of nuclear weapons. That kind of prospect of letting that happen, I think, has graver economic consequences. So I would say the constituencies around Europe, normal everyday people, understand this and are communicating to their politicians and making plain this need to keep supporting Ukraine, and to understand what this fight is about. We should not be allowing neo-imperial conquest anywhere in the world, and we should be learning the lessons of the 20th century when it comes to the gravest weapons we've ever created.
That brings me to what others have described as if Russia is a bear, there's a gorilla, a huge gorilla, King Kong, is in the room when you talk about China. And China is also in the mix of all of this. And for those like you that I've spoken to, they've pointed out that China has similar designs on Taiwan. But China is no Russia. Many of the things that have been applied against Russia cannot be applied against China. It's simply too big. And in that kind of situation, how do you think that should be handled? Because many of the things that you've talked about, that this crisis, that this war in Ukraine represents, would also be brought to bear if China were, as it has said repeatedly, to try to take Taiwan by force. And many of the similar actors in this crisis will be called to action. I mean, the US president has committed the United States yet again to going to Taiwan's defense if it were attacked by China.
Ladi, this gets back to the issue you raised about the F-16s. If the American government and other allies are slow walking the provision of these weapons, it's only really prolonging the inevitable here. There have been very irresponsible statements from Western analysts in places like Washington and London that seem to say that, look, Ukraine should just give up some of its territory and this will all be over. The fact of the matter is, Ukraine was neutral in 2013. No one really was advocating for NATO in Ukraine in even early 2014 after Crimea was annexed. And we've seen what happens, that if we let this incremental aggression take place, we're just going to see over time what we did in February of last year, a full-scale, brutal invasion. And that needs to be recognized and confronted. In the same way, if we help Ukraine win and win quickly, I think it sends a message about how clearly we wish to stand up for these principles of the international legal order, the idea that countries have borders, they should be respected, the notion that you can't just send troops and start sending cruise missiles at residential areas in neighboring countries because you wish to, because you think historically it belongs to you. And so your question is really important as it pertains to China, because if we really wish to send a message that there should be stability in the Pacific, that any designs over Taiwan and territorial designs of Beijing's on Taiwan would receive a full-throated, coherent, and concerted response from the rest of the world. The best way to send that message is, of course, to quickly accelerate the provision of these weapons so Ukraine can reclaim its territory and we can have a semblance of stability once more. So I think the issue here is making a message clear to China. And the best way to do that is to, of course, get weapons to Ukraine, F-16s in particular, so it can protect its skies. That's the best way to show that China has its best interest in maintaining a stable international legal order and an economic order that has clearly benefited them over the past generation or two.
Two things are said to have happened as, I don't know if you want to call them side benefits or bonuses as a result of what had happened, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that is that it appeared, particularly in the days and weeks immediately after that happened, that a newfound solidarity and unity of purpose was brought to bear on two strategic institutions, the European Union and NATO. Those two institutions seem to have stepped up to the plate. Even traditionally, those you would describe as the more troublesome members were all brought on board, in terms of tackling the crisis. But since then, it appears as if we've seen some of that unity fray at the edges as economic issues and sanctions and local politics were brought to bear. Some of them were brought to the spotlight as a result of their relationship with Russia preceding the war, and that is now being brought to bear. Now, this is happening, as I said, just as Britain, which would probably be the second biggest single country contributor to Ukraine's survival, left the EU. Even though now it is cooperating with it. Do you think that, given what we have witnessed, Ukraine can still continue to count on this solidarity and unity, especially as time goes on and some of the initial resolve begins to wear thin?
Such a great question. It's one that keeps me up at night, to be honest, Ladi. And I would say that for your listeners and your viewers, I find it terrific and inspiring that you maintain your daily focus and regular focus on this issue, because I think that will make the difference. If all of us are paying attention to this war, understanding the grave stakes, no matter where we are, Europe, Africa, Latin America, this has an impact on everyone. And if we keep paying attention to it, I do believe that the support for Ukraine and the solidarity with the Ukrainians will be maintained. And but at the same time, I'm not naive, and I understand that over time, it's difficult to steady the focus of different audiences on these issues. But if anything, we all remember the shock of February 2022. If we all remember the numerous times various politicians in Europe and around the world said that this invasion wouldn't happen. Of course, the Biden administration was adamant that it would happen, but there was a lot of pushback to this narrative. If we remember the shock when we saw that it did occur, that this full-scale invasion of Europe's largest country into Europe's second largest country, if we recall that shock and that horror, if anything, we've only seen the worst things confirmed. What we've seen here is the Russian state committing acts of genocide against the Ukrainian people, eliminating their own identity, making a point of shelling schools, libraries, museums, taking away their cultural heritage, simply because they don't think it should exist. That's only been confirmed over the past 452 days. And I think we need to remember that nothing has really changed in the calculus here, that the international shock should still resonate among us. And if it does, and if we keep ourselves informed, then I'm hopeful that that support will be resilient enough. It will find cracks, certainly. There will be phases and periods of time in which it weakens. I have no doubt about that. But on the whole, I think morally, intellectually, and politically, this is as close as we come to an issue that is morally and politically clear in its rectitude. And I think if we keep that focus, I'm hopeful that the support will continue.
Final question, Rory. The Pope is said to be involved now. The Vatican is involved in a peace mission to try to end this conflict. The Pope had tried to get involved earlier. That didn't quite gain any traction. The Brazilian president, Lula, has also tried to get involved. At some point, the Turkish president also, had some success, particularly with the grain deal that was negotiated. Do any of these people strike you as being able to make a dent in what has so far proved to be intractable?
What a great question. I'm not hopeful, and the reason is that all of those actors you just mentioned have really well-intentioned objectives for peace, and I don't doubt that they mean it. But the reality is, the Russians will not stop until they have conquered and defeated Ukraine, and by that we mean that Ukraine really, for all intents and purposes, will not exist. There's a familiar motto at protests and demonstrations that if Russia stops the war, we'll have peace. But if Ukraine stops the war, there'll be no Ukraine. And I think that the Pope has not been as morally forthright as he could be, particularly as a Jesuit, a critically trained scholar and thinker. He's played a little bit of an equivalence here and made it sound as if this is an interethnic war in which two sides are fighting with each other and need to come to the table, and as you recall, carry the cross with each other. He invited a Russian woman and a Ukrainian woman to carry the cross together. I understand the beautiful meaning of that. At the same time, it does equivocate and does not show that there is an aggressive side here and there's a side that is defending itself. President Lula, unfortunately, has really been parroting the Russian disinformation narratives about this war, blaming NATO and the West for what's happened here, which is really absurd as someone who comes from the perspective of promoting Ukrainian studies in Britain and in Europe. I can tell you with great certainty that NATO and the EU, frankly, politically, were not paying close attention to Ukraine. If anything, they wanted stability with Russia so they could make money with Russia. And if you go around London today, you can see the legacy of that. Half the city is owned and has been owned by Russian interests. So when Lula says these things, I really think it does a horrible disservice to the many thousands of civilians who are running into bomb shelters right now, fleeing cruise missiles from the Kremlin. And I think the Pope doesn't serve peace when he makes this moral equivocation. I think it's important for us to understand that there's an aggressive side and it needs to be called out and confronted. And we need to show solidarity to the side that's defending itself. And not only that, seeking to keep its survival on the horizon. And that's a really key issue. So I think until we understand the Russian threat here, until we understand its aspiration for total conquest, then these attempts to mediate and find a peaceful solution just aren't going to work. The only thing that will work, sadly, is affecting a marked, evident defeat of Russian military aggression. The kind of message that would repeat to states all around the world that they cannot just invade and torture and kill other people in other countries just because they can.
Rory Fidin, Associate Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for your time and for your perspective. Frank talk this morning.
Thank you.
Invasion. Swedish and Finnish troops practice carrying out amphibious operations south of Stockholm as part of the largest national defense exercise of its kind in Sweden in 25 years. The maneuvers, which saw Finnish and Swedish troops practicing working together during operations, were a part of Aurora 23, an exercise that launched across Sweden on April the 17th, with some 26,000 personnel taking part and troops from 14 nations, including the United States, Britain, and France, participating. The drill came shortly after Finland, which applied to join NATO in May last year with Sweden, became the 31st member of the alliance earlier last month.
What operational things? Though that Finland had joined NATO and we are waiting for the membership, it is of great importance. We feel safer today when Finland has joined, and we will feel, of course, even more safer when we are joining NATO. But before that, prior to that, we need to continue our great exercises which we have had so many decades back.
It's even more important to do cooperation between Finland and Sweden when we both are in NATO in the future. So it's good. We have always do cooperation, and I'm pretty sure that we are doing that in NATO also.
And joining NATO for me is a very good thing. I've always been of that opinion that it should be good to be in NATO, and it feels more comfortable. I think we have a lot more people taking on our side now, and it's more safer feeling.
It's very good that Finland is entering NATO. We expect to be second after them. So for us, it's only good to have this exercise together with them, and we will join NATO later. So it's not a problem for us. We are used to exercise together with Finnish troops.
A spokesman for U.S. Central Command says Russian pilots tried to dogfight U.S. jets over Syria. Colonel Joe Buccino says the attempts have happened in several of the most recent instances of aggressive behavior from Russian pilots. A U.S. official says the Russian pilots do not appear to be trying to shoot down American jets, but they may be trying to provoke the U.S. and draw us into an international incident, according to Colonel Buccino. In military aviation, dogfighting is engaging in aerial combat, often at relatively close range. And Russia's foreign ministry says that Russia will retaliate after Polish authorities seized the Russian embassy school in Warsaw. Russian state news agency reported that police and staff from the Warsaw City Hall entered the campus over the weekend, asking employees to leave the premises. The ministry described the action as controversial, illegal, and provocative. A Polish foreign ministry spokesman said that while Russia had a right to protest, they were acting within the law. However, authorities say the school will continue to operate from a different part of the Russian embassy. Quoting Russia's ambassador to Poland, Sergei Andreev. Pope Francis has said the Vatican is involved in a peace mission to try to end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, declining to give further details. Speaking to reporters during a flight home after a 3-day visit to Hungary, the Pope said in his words, quote, "I am willing to do everything that has to be done. There is a mission in course now, but it is not yet public. When it is public, I will reveal it. I think that peace is always made by opening channels. You can never achieve peace through closure. This is not easy." The Pope added that he had spoken about the situation in Ukraine with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and with Metropolitan Hilarion, a bishop representing the Russian Orthodox Church in Budapest. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in February of last year, Pope Francis has pleaded for peace practically on a weekly basis and has repeatedly expressed a wish to act as a broker between Kiev and Moscow. His offer has so far failed to produce any breakthrough. Let's talk to national security risk strategist and former British police officer. Joining us from Enugu-Egidi in Anambra State is Vince Onyekwelu. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning. How are you? Good morning, Nigeria.
I'm fine. Let's look at this. Finally, the Ukrainian president has talked a bit about this coming counteroffensive we've been hearing about now for months, even though he also admits that they don't have everything, particularly they don't have the fighter jets that they were anticipating that they would have. Do you think this is going to make a major difference to how much they are able to achieve in this stage of the conflict?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that obviously I don't see any strategic backline to a planned counteroffensive that has been made public to even your enemy forces to be aware that you're planning a counteroffensive precisely in the month of May. Why would a strategic, well-organized national army actually tell your enemy that you're planning to do a counteroffensive and even give a specific time of period of May? Obviously, summertime. That's number one. Number two, even the jets that Mr. President Zelensky is requesting for, one, what types of jets is he requesting for? Does his military have the airmen that have the training on how to use and deploy and return those very expensive machines back to base. Because one thing for a pilot is to take a machine out from an airport or from a sea vessel or any other way jet can take off. You have to return it back to base. It's not about taking it out, it's about bringing it back to base. Now, if you look at this yes and no, it beggars belief why they should be announced to the Russians that they are plans for the counter-offensive. And number two, do they have the resources, the airmen that can be able to take care of this expensive bird? Because these are taxpayers' money from across the NATO nations. No nation wants to give you this kind of expensive bird or fighter jet that you're not sure of bringing them back. Because look at the Leopard tankers that were given to them. Many of them even got damaged during a training exercise. One of them actually tumbled down from a mountain side and crashed. That is taxpayers' money from the UK, from France, wasted. So I think there should be better strategy, not telling your enemies what you have in mind, and you have to have the resources to make sure that these jets are well used and maintained.
Let's look at the other side of this. Of course, the Russians themselves have been preparing, shall we say, for this counteroffensive for months as well, even as the fighting has gone on in Bakhmut, and they have continued their missile strikes on different parts of Ukraine. So I guess the converse question to ask is that, is there going to be any real surprise in this for the Russians? Because they've been expecting this for so long. There's been so much made about it. And now that they know that the Ukrainians don't yet have, the kind of jets that could make a difference in an air battle, will they really be afraid of this?
Yes. The Russians should be concerned. They should be very afraid. Why? Number one, a couple of hours ago, we have obviously unconfirmed intelligence that said and then into Odessa. And there are a couple of them that are right now stationed in Odessa. And one of the most pivotal issues from the unconfirmed intel is that most of these jets that are entering the Ukrainian airspace have switched off their transponders. What is a transponder? In military, in Air Force, a transponder is a kind of a mechanical device that when switched on, nations on ground can send radio frequencies. And once it touches that transponders that are activated on, it will give you information about the jet, where it's coming from, where it took off from, where it's registered to. But once it's turned off, those radio frequencies cannot bounce back to land to give you information. So it becomes that issue of question, who are the owners of this jet that are passing through Moldova, through Romania, into the port of Odessa, and with their transponders switched off. So I think Russia should be concerned, because there are school of thoughts that have claimed, even though unconfirmed, that Russia is not just fighting Ukraine, that Russia is fighting Ukraine and all the NATO nations, even though Ukraine is kept in the forefront. I think it's only about Ukraine and Russia. So Russia should be concerned. Look at the Crimea fuel reservoir. It's massive, because that's tons and millions and tons of fuel damage. So Russia should be concerned, because this is war. Everything is fair upon war.
Something else that would appear that the Russians should be concerned about is the threat by the Wagner Group boss that he's going to withdraw his troops from Bakhmut if he doesn't get more ammunition from the Ministry of Defense. Is this grandstanding, or is this a real problem now?
Now, it could be grandstanding, it could be a strategy, it could be a problem. Number one, it could be a problem that it could be honest, it could be truthful, it could be sincere, that Wagner boss made such a statement. But honestly, in this kind of war, there are so many propaganda. This could have also come from the NATO allies trying to claim that this is coming from the Wagner boss, because there should be a better lines of communication between the Wagner boss and the Russian Federation and the military commander, not to come and put it straight in CNN or BBC, all this. So it could be propaganda, it could be true. But look at what's happening in Bakhmut. Bakhmut, whoever wins in Bakhmut, it's a wasteland now. It's been destroyed. And there are information coming from left, right, and center about who is winning. There are reports coming from the Russian part, and they won more 4 areas in the past 24 hours. There's reports coming from the Ukrainian side that they've conquered 4 more areas in the last 24 hours. So it's a lot of propaganda, false news. So nobody actually knows what's going on. But the truth is, just like in Sudan, the so-called paramilitary seem to be gaining advantage. In Ukraine, Russia seems to be having advantage in Bakhmut. And they're switching the war now across to the Odessa and Kharkiv, because the fortification of Bakhmut, I'm not sure that Odessa have that kind of fortification that they have in Bakhmut. The fortification they have in Bakhmut is not what they have in Kharkiv. So the level of
Unfortunately, we seem to have lost Vince Onyekwelu there, joining us from Enugu in Anambra State. Interesting perspective he has on this ongoing conflict. Let's go straight to Ini John Mekwa, who is joining us from our business desk. There's always
Good morning.
a situation to make money, business
or
strategies,
lose
or lose. And speaking about that, EU governments have extended the suspension of duties and tariffs for goods coming from Ukraine. But we know that there's an ongoing problem as a result of that suspension, which we spent the bulk of last week discussing, where the farmers in some other countries were protesting. This extension, you know, what does that have?
Is by a year. So, you know, they were having series of meetings last week, hoping that they will agree that, the duties should come back so that at least it will be a level field or a level playing ground for farmers from Ukraine and the other EU countries. But I guess the sympathy for Ukraine, as you have discussed, they still have that major battle, Bakhmut and some others there, a lot of people dying right there. So I guess the sympathy of that still outweighs. And we know that President Zelensky has been very vocal, talking about some of what they're going through and the need for aid from different fronts. So that seemed to have outweighed it for the 1 year. The tariff duty suspension still stands. But of course, you also have the other part where they're still insisting that they can use those corridors, Poland and Hungary and all of that.
To take their goods elsewhere.
Exactly, and strictly that. But let's see how it goes, because the farmers are still not happy.
No.
The parliamentaries of these other EU countries are not happy, because it's obviously weighing down their revenue. Is affecting the livelihood of the farmers in these countries. And you cannot give what you do not have.
Now, BRICS, very interesting.
Very, very interesting.
BRICS currency. That has always been an idea that had been muted almost since the creation of BRICS. But now it looks as if agreement on this can come as early as this year.
We've talked about BRICS, we've talked about how they meet and all of that, but the issue of the currency, well, they haven't yet agreed, but they say they most likely will agree by this year. 2023.
They have that big meeting in South Africa in August.
In August. And also remember that they have the Russia-Africa meeting in July. You know, we already have South Africa as part of BRICS. And they say about 19 other countries have applied to be members of BRICS. So if they have the numbers and they can agree, it might not be that easy. We can learn from what's going on in EU, because countries will always want to protect themselves, and countries are not at the same level of development at every point in time. So having a consensus might be kind of difficult, depending on who is ready to sacrifice what. But for them to have come up to say they may have an agreement on a BRICS currency in 2023, that is impressive, because countries like India, they're having a bit of issues with the cheap oil they buy from Russia because of payment systems.
Right.
You know, they do rubles and all of that, but also it's not that easy for them to get rubles, you know, so they're having some hitches and thinking of ways to solve it. And of course, if they have these BRICS, it might just be one way to solve it. But let's see the agreement first.
Thanks very much, Ini. For that, of course, we'll keep an eye on all the business outcomes throughout the day, not just from Ukraine, but from everywhere else.
Yeah.
Thanks once again,
Thank you for having me.
Finally, on the program, after wins in several gymnastics events, Russian athletes were delighted to hear their national anthem during the podium ceremony at the Alba Games in Caracas, Venezuela. Coach Liezhyn Savitskaya said, quote, "We have not competed under the Russian flag at international competitions for so long. We're very grateful to your country, your government, which allowed us to perform under the Russian anthem and flag." Sevastia's 12-year-old pupil gymnast Nicole Rimarchanin won first place in the all-round category after competing against athletes from Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. The Russian gymnastics team also won first place in the group category. The event was the 5th edition of the biannual Alba Games, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. Venezuelan authorities said they were expecting 3,000 athletes from fellow Alba member countries Bolivia, Antigua and Barbuda, Cuba, Dominica, Grenada, Nicaragua, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Russia, which is participating as a guest country. That's our package on this May Day. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akeredoluale. Do enjoy the rest of the national holiday. Good morning.